Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Europe is facing disruption on many fronts, from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia to an unstable political situation in Germany and protests in Serbia. Add to this Donald Trump's comments that he will uphold the US commitment to NATO only so long as alliance countries pay their due amount for defence. How should Europe respond to these challenges in a cohesive manner? Well, to explore this, I'm joined by Marta Prochwicz, Deputy Head of Warsaw Office, European Council. Marta, thank you very much for taking the time to join us, and welcome.
Thank you very much.
First time of meeting, although you've been here
Indeed.
Many times. So let's start with NATO. How do you assess Donald Trump's statement that, pay your fair share or we're not going to take responsibility for you?
I think that is a very fair request. And it's not something that comes as a surprise to anybody in Europe. First of all, he's been saying it in his first term, and Europeans have managed to increase their defense spending almost up to 23 countries right now out of the 32 alliance members. And this is what they were expecting. So European leaders all throughout Europe, even though for many of them it's going to be a challenge to be able to live up to the 2% or even up to 3%, because that's what we're hearing right now. They are very aware that this is one of the primary requirements that Donald Trump has, and he needs to have a political win. And this could be something that he goes back to his domestic public and says, I managed to get the Europeans on board on increasing their defense spending.
Right, but is it a requirement that he has, or simply part of the NATO requirement that every country should pay 2%? And many countries have not been thus far. So, I mean, that figure has changed recently. He's just saying, we're paying for more than we should be. I mean, it shouldn't come as a surprise, as you say. But he's now pushed it up to 3% or more, which, again, is in light of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The challenge, of course, always with the European Union is that there are 27 countries in it, right? And what happens to those countries that aren't geared up to increase their defense spending to those levels?
Well, it's very fair to say that perhaps 3% won't even actually be enough. So absolutely, you're right. The regulation, the EU requirement is 2%. Donald Trump wants to bring it up to 3%, and there's a very big difference between that being written in the rules, the procedures of NATO and countries trying to live up to that versus the political will. So I think that his personality and his stance on this is very important to push these countries to live up to that. Now, whether they're able to or not is an entirely different question, because many countries, and I think that a lot of them are giving a lot of pushback. But this works in tandem with all the other issues that we are bargaining about with the United States. So it's a large set of items that we are discussing with them, and this actually is one of the easiest ones to fulfill. And given the security situation in Europe, it's quite clear that if we want to avoid a bigger conflict with countries to our east that are explicitly threatening us, we need to spend the 3% now in order to avoid spending something like 5% in the near future. And everybody's very much on board with that, right, even though domestically it's going to be a struggle. It's
going to be a bit of a challenge getting the infrastructure in place to actually increase spending in that area. Yeah. Is there a space there for more investment in some kind of European defence structure in parallel to NATO?
Well, I think that these conversations are related, but at the same time, they're not. So on the one hand, the defense spending goes towards the requirement within NATO and making sure that these countries in their own national context have the required equipment, have the armed forces that are necessary. Now, whether this goes towards a European force is not something that is being discussed right now, because the idea of a European army is very much out of reach, and also not something that would necessarily provide us with enough deterrence from Russia. The main structure that we have to make sure that Europeans are safe remains NATO. That's why this conversation about the spending and maintaining the U.S. element at very high costs for Europeans, but nevertheless maintaining the U.S. in Europe is very important. Now, of course, in parallel, what European defense can do is make sure that we have enough funding for specific EU programs that then allow Europeans to, for example, procure arms together. And the sum of these things, the national defense spending plus the EU programs that have money to procure arms together, which makes it just basically cheaper for European countries, is what we call the European pillar of NATO. So making sure that the EU or European countries that want to take part in this have the money in order to be able to spend more domestically, and therefore increase the NATO, or sort of live up to the NATO requirement.
Understood. Understood. Well, that of course makes sense. Bulk discount, if I can put it in a simple way.
Pretty much, yeah.
But Poland, of course, is in the lead here. It's spending well over 4% on defence at the moment. Do you think Poland has a role in aligning other EU countries in the way that you've just described?
Well, first of all, Poland has the intent to spend over 4%, but in actual terms and numbers, it's not always that easy to sign these types of contracts. It's not always easy to find this sort of off-the-shelf equipment. These are very long-term projects that require time. So for last year, it won't be able to reach the 4%. That does not change the fact that we are leading and we are the voice of Europe when it comes to this sort of approach. Now, whether it has a role, it has a role right now, which it's playing through its EU Council presidency in making sure that Europe goes into the strategic direction. So there's absolutely
space for influence there.
Exactly, yeah.
Understood. Let's move now to the Balkans, in particular Serbia, of course. For the last 3 months there have been protests on the streets against corruption at government level. The EU is keen to get the Balkans into the fold. What can the EU do to facilitate that process in the light of the accusations of corruption by students and others in that country?
Well, first of all, the EU, the lack of EU enlargement towards the Western Balkans has been one of the greatest problems and failures of the EU over the last decade. They've been saying explicitly that they want to join the EU, and there has been a lack of progress on that end. So the fact that now we have a new wave of enlargement, a sort of geopolitical push in order to try to bring new countries into the EU, is definitely speaks to the strength of the European Union, because enlargement is one of its strengths. So what it has to do is to make sure that we make enough efforts to also to make sure that countries such as Serbia, which are under very big influence from malign actors such as Russia, see the benefits of joining the EU, because there's a lot of disappointment on their side. So it's about bringing the benefits of the European Union to these countries right now.
Yes, but again, you know, the challenge of accusations of corruption, surely that's a bit of a barrier to absorbing them, isn't it? I mean, it is something certainly that the EU needs to address before they can be fully embedded.
Yeah, that's a discussion between whether we're following very strict criteria on EU membership, the Copenhagen criteria, or whether we see it as a geopolitical push. Now, one has to complement the other.
Right.
There has to be a parallel track. And the other aspect of it is the fact that when we had the last big enlargement wave, we had these countries were in NATO beforehand.
Right.
So what we did is that NATO sort of looked into the security aspects. They were the ones counting.
So it was just easier to kind of align those countries' policies.
Because the NATO
Right.
NATO already looked into the things such as, to be very blunt, the number of Russian
Right.
spies in that
Right,
country.
right.
Now, the EU, what it needs to do in this enlargement process is take on more of these responsibilities, because
Right.
the NATO track is not.
It's not the same.
Not the
Yeah.
same right
Yeah,
now. It's
right.
not there, and it's not a very short-term prospect. So
Okay.
the EU needs to take on these defense responsibilities and make sure that these countries not only fight with corruption, but also look at the number
Understood. Very, very quickly now in the last few seconds we have left, Marta. Germany, some political turmoil going on there with the AfD, the far-right party, actually second in the polls. What is the influence that this situation has on EU political direction?
Well, the election is definitely something that will have a great impact on the way that the EU is going, because Germany was traditionally an important motor of the EU, and it has gone missing for the last couple of years. And it's going to mean a lot that in case the front runner, right? Because you mentioned the number two, but the front runner is actually the CDU with Friedrich Merz. So if that materializes and he becomes the new chancellor, according to what his political statements are in his political program, he's going to be back on board with the majority sort of liberal political elite of Europe to look at transforming the EU
Right.
into a strategic actor.
Understood, understood. Marta Prochwicz, thank you very much indeed for sharing
Thank
your
you.
analysis with our audience. Have a good day.
You too, thank you.
And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.